Hello, and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. In this episode, we're joined once again by friend of the pod, Justin Carpenter, to discuss the Metal Gear Solid series. We talk about names, simulations, reality, and calling our friends while standing in a piss stream. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Congrats again on the KRZ article. I still haven't, sorry, dude, I haven't gotten a chance to read through,
Yeah,
but
it's busy.
sorry, Brian. Oh, you finished you finished an Outer Wilds piece too, right?
I finished two since we talked
Oh my
on the
God.
same game on related things. It was really hard to do. I've never written like that before. I wrote a piece about story world formation. It was tied to the talk I gave, like metalepsis, methexis, mise on a beam, as these things, these devices that consistently help to create a story world or like give it, make it cognizable, I guess, or yeah. Anyway, and I looked at basically the beginning and the ending of Outer Wilds. There's this sequence where you go through a museum,
Yeah.
and the museum at first, it sort of seems like a science museum. You're learning how to behave in the game world, and it's kind of a tutorial like that. But when it repeats, it's a form of communication that pulls you into the proper narrative level that you're supposed to start seeing the game from. And so through that repetition, um, because a lot of the time, when we talk about things in literature, it's about the deictic shift from the storytelling context to the story world context. In Outer Wilds, that's less of a problem because you're playing the game, right? Like it's not deictic shifting, it's metaleptic shifting. But that isn't narratively supported enough. And so they have to kind of like resituate you in through this like recursive space of the museum. It resituates your perspective. And then the other paper that I just finished last week is about the process of learning to think space and time as you move through the game. You move from iterative feedback, which is like narrative sequence, but it's also gameplay, like the moment to moment gameplay. Uh, and then you have to start to think about like distributed causality to understand how planets interact with each other. And then third, you have to start thinking about how things are entangled in non-causal ways. And then finally, you see entropy as so it's like this move from these four things, which is the framework the other paper fits in. And I had to stay consistent and I left it to like the last 2 weeks because I was just like, I don't want to write another paper on the same thing.
Both of those
Yeah.
sound awesome. I'd forgotten that you returned to the museum at the end of Outer Wilds, which is
Yes.
super fascinating. I mean, museums and games in general, it seem
Uh-huh.
like there's a museum in The Last of Us, Part Two. There's a museum in the Stanley Parable.
Yeah.
Um, Brian, you got to play Outer Wilds.
I know. Yeah.
It's
It's
just
unbelievable. Yeah, there's what I've said doesn't ruin anything because it's abstract enough that you'll yeah, it won't impact how you get to the answers of that game at all. So,
right.
um yeah, it's an interesting game just to study how it teaches. Like I watched Let's Plays to prepare for writing this paper, and I was really struck by the way the game teaches you how to play. It implies everything, and it's very yeah, it's really nice. But anyway, yeah, so I've been on leave this term, and I'm just writing as much as I can while not writing my book at all. So yeah, it's been fun.
That's the way you do it. You just don't write the book until suddenly you have a book, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I guess part of me is like, well, if enough of these articles don't get any traction anywhere else, they'll just be book chapters. So I'll just do
Yeah.
that.
Or it's like the quantum
Um,
mechanic in Outer Wilds. Like if you're not looking at the book, maybe you'll turn
it
around and
doesn't.
it'll be there,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know.
That's great. Yeah.
So
So go
go ahead.
ahead, please.
No, you go ahead.
Uh, I was just saying. So I've been um I didn't have time to play Metal Gear Solid 3. You asked before we started recording. But yeah, I'm so familiar with the series and uh it's been basically a lifelong love. Like there's a really personal relationship with that game. So I think I'm comfortable to talk about it.
Yeah, I think we're similar in that like Metal Gear is in, I mean, it's in my DNA, not just as a player of games, but like just it so informs how I understand games and what I like, it sort of still is a structure that kind of dictates what I like about certain games. I've talked about this at length on this podcast, but there's a kind of this combination in Metal Gear Solid, specifically the Solid series, of incredible granularity to the simulation, but a kind of tightness and precision. So you can have like granular simulation in like Fallout, but it's not a tight game. It's not precise. I mean, things are very just sort of sloppy, and I don't mean that as a like, I don't mean they're literally sloppy, but they just we talked about this also, Brian. Like things are a little unreliable. Like they're glitchy. You don't, you can't always, you just can't trust the game and trust the simulation. Maybe that's it. And I think in Metal Gear Solid, you can always trust the simulation. The simulation is so powerfully constituted that you can perform traumatic acts on the simulation and it will run with the perfection of a Ferrari, you know? And that's, I have a piece on Metal Gear about this, with this kind of Michelangelo of YouTube showmanship, who does these spectacular creative kills in of the guards, which is like the core of my love for the series is messing with guards. And he's doing truly astounding sort of feats of assassination and execution, kind of like Rube Goldberg contraptions of interconnected death, but he also exploits weirdnesses, right, in the simulation. Like he finds these little I say he, but actually they, I don't know their gender, but uh they find uh these weird little corner cases in the simulation where the game, it almost seems like the game isn't working like it's supposed to, but everything still functions quite precisely. So like a guard will clip through something, but he'll still manage to do a spectacular headshot in the middle of the clipping. And it's like these sort of extreme um uh scenarios or pressure points in the simulation where he kind of like it just lives in them and explores them. And in spite of sort of breaking the game, what he's really showing is that the game always works, you know? And so that's the thing. I don't know if I've ever actually, Brian, you mentioned that you had a crash, right? But I don't know if I've ever encountered a physics glitch in a Metal Gear game, which is astounding. I mean, not that that's the sort of be all end all criterion for a game, but like it's just so striking how, you know, everything runs with the cleanliness of Mario Odyssey, but it's so much more complicated in terms of how many systems are active at once.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't. I'll just say quickly to explain for what happened for my crashes for Justin because I don't know if you were. Well, actually, I don't think we even talked about it yet on the pod, but I've been playing on the Switch, and so I played two and three for the first time actually. So that's my history with the game. I just kind of quickly played both games over the past couple months, and in two. After the are they called Metal Gears? Is that what they're called? Or the Metal Gear Rays or whatever they are? The fight where you have to kill like 25 of them or something. Then the cutscene began and then my screen went black, like it was still lit, but it was black. And this is after, the whole part of the game where the game itself seems to kind of start glitching and doing all these weird things with the interface. And so I put the Switch down for like about a few minutes and I was like, okay, maybe this is some kind of weird in-game glitch, test that's supposed to happen. But then after about 15 minutes went by, I realized that the game had just glitched and I had to restart it and just play through that entire fight again. And the same thing happened, I think, twice actually uh, in Metal Gear Solid 3 after I can't remember exactly which I think it might have been the sorrow after the sorrow sequence, which luckily isn't too difficult to get past, but just takes forever, kind of. And the screen did the same thing; it just went green. Yeah, but I think our original, idea is just that Nathan, I think you put it well. Like it will just run perfectly no matter what you do. Whereas in a game like Fallout,
which is kind of my maybe benchmark for messing around in games, for lack of a better term, something like Fallout or Oblivion. Um, you can do whatever you want to a certain extent, but then, someone might walk through a door and kill you in one hit or something like that. Something really strange that's not supposed to happen is liable to go down the more you're messing with the game.
I was just gonna ask actually if that's tied to the porting for the Metal Gear Solid collection, because on the PS2, I don't think it's possible. It just doesn't seem like it's maybe it's a thing I built in my head, but yeah, these games have always been Nintendo levels of polished,
Mm.
uh, in my view. They run pretty much perfectly. I can't I can't even five with being unfinished. The Metal Gear series has seemingly always been like their engine just seems to always be able to account for whatever you can think of.
Yeah.
And part of for me, part of what always made the Metal Gear games so interesting is this weird. I would say that Metal Gear Solid 1 was my first like vaguely immersive sim level experience where the systems are working together in a way that creates this like almost harmonious feeling of as soon as you understand how to leverage those systems, they work for you. And there are like numerous ways to encounter certain things, like the laser sights, smoking a cigarette will help you, but there are other ways of sneaking around. You can create mist in the air, smoke. You can find other ways to deal with these problems. And that's part of the like unspoken agreement that the simulation's always going to be well wrought and reliable. But at the same time, there's this like arcadey, it's like an arcadey immersive sim. And I think Metal Gear Solid 3 is the first time that it is fully realized, because to me, this is where the Metal Gear series kind of becomes coherent across the rest of the titles. Like, this is the game that kind of sets the precedent for the later phase of the series, where it's much more about open world, but open world that is basically an immersive sim. Uh, so I've been replaying the game Prey, and not to get too sidetracked, but one of the cool things about Prey, and this is maybe a spoiler, I don't know, is that at the start of the game, you can leverage it so that the water system on the space station, Talos 1, gives you psionic, uh, it fuels your psionic powers, and there are water fountains all over the station. So if you manipulate this one feature just by thinking this is a whole space that everything intersects, I can change the nature of my gameplay, and that'll determine how I choose to scale up, all these things. And returning to games like System Shock 2, which I've played since we last spoke, for the first time, I actually hadn't played it before. It's that exact design philosophy. Like doing one thing here has ramifications for everywhere else. And I think that Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, 3 were the first time I really felt that in a game. It's but it's arcadey in the fact that you can kind of yeah, you can kind of wing it, which has this weird tonal it's like it's weirdly tonally wrong for how competent the people you're controlling are supposed to be. And so you can make these hyper competent people look really silly. And that just kind of adds to the simulated delight. I don't know. There's like a certain ecstasy in playing these games when you get them down. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm reminded now of my first experience playing Metal Gear Solid 1, which would have been in 1999, I think a year after, maybe like, a few months after it came out. It comes out in 98.
Same as me. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so I'm trying to just do the math here. I would have been 11, I think. And not to date myself on mic here, but um, I remember two moments of actual sort of out of body like revelatory wonder. Very distinct actually, and they're both from the opening minutes of the game. The first one was the first time I stepped in a puddle and a guard said, "What was that sound?" Because I'd never encountered a game, and this is now we're used to this. Like every game has a kind of vulgar, like bastardized form of the Metal Gear Solid stealth, system, so that like in, Assassin's Creed, you can whistle to distract a guard or whatever, and it sucks. But in Metal Gear Solid 1, I'd never seen, maybe it existed in other games, but for me as a console gamer, I'd never seen a video game enemy react to a sound, dynamically, such that Metal Gear guards have actual sensoria. They have eyes and they have ears. And then in later games, they have bodies and they have self-consciousness because if you point a gun at their crotch, they'll, you know, panic. And that is a goofy thing, but it also is incredibly existentially important because it means that the guards' own bodies are differentiated in their own consciousness of themselves. And they react not to an action, but simply to the direction of your eyes, which is a degree of sort of phenomenological differentiation that no game has today. I can't think of a single game that actually differentiates guards. And maybe I've said this before on this podcast. I can't remember, but it's astounding. So the kind of depth of the enemy sensoria was one. The second one was in Metal Gear Solid 1, you go up the elevator and then you go past the helicopter and you sneak into the tank hangar and then you crawl through the vents. And I distinctly remember crawling through the vents, and there are a few moments when you're in the vents over the cells. So you have to go down to the jail cells to find the DARPA chief. And you can see Meryl and other, maybe other prisoners by peering through the slits in the vents. And Justin, you can probably speak to this better than I, but there seemed to be something so profound, and I couldn't articulate it as a kid, and I'll try now, about that simple act of like peering through a partially obstructing medium into another space with a person in it. Um, you know, for one, I think this is partly because in the PS1 generation and 64 generation, I'm sure it occurs, but I don't know how often you could even look through glass and see something. So Tomb Raider does this. Glass works in Tomb Raider. You can look through a window and see what's behind the window. That's a striking aspect of Tomb Raider. But this was like that, but actually more complicated because glass is just a nothing. Glass is just a transparent film in a game. Whereas here, it wasn't looking through a transparent film. It was looking through between these solid opaque slats, So it was like you're basically the medium that you're peering through was phenomenologically recognized as solid, opaque, and real. And yet you could also look through it, through the opacity, and dynamically see in between the openings in the vent another space that was entirely rendered that had an animated entity inside that space. So it wasn't like a picture of the space. It wasn't a fake, it wasn't a prop, it wasn't a stage set. It was actually the space. So you're inhabiting two spaces at once, whereas games conditioned us, I think, largely to treat spaces as totally self-contained. So like you load into each space, and you understand that space as ontologically separate from other spaces. And so that moment of like, I'm in this space, but I'm not in this space. I'm in, it's like I could stick my hand through this vent and I could feel that I'm actually in both spaces at once, that these two virtual environments have been smushed together in a way that actually simulates spatial interconnectivity was absolutely mind-blowing. And I replayed the game recently, this semester, and I was still blown away by that. Like, it's just, you know, I I wish I understood more about how the actual, how the game is running there, and whether it's, I assume it's difficult just in that no other game was doing that. But that speaks to another aspect of the systemic complexity of Metal Gear, which is not just its physics systems and its simulation, but also just the way it renders reality, physical reality. Um, so these are, sorry, Brian, I know we're sort of jumping back in time a bit to but like this is totally foundational of what's the act I mean, for me, the actual core of the series, not the paranoid conspiracy Illuminati plots, which are interesting, right? Or the postmodern or whatever, the kind of self-referential recursive gestures, but really just this basic physical simulation, physics, a simulation of physics and a simulation of physical reality as such.
Yeah. So I did listen to your last episode with about Metal Gear Solid 2, and you brought up the earlier games, and we can kind of uh I I would love to just briefly do that because I think there is an arc to what Metal Gear Solid 3 is trying to do that is in the context of these earlier games. Um, so the first Metal Gear game is, I would say, by all accounts, like very average, and Kojima came onto the game late and kind of salvaged it. And it had a crazy ending. The twist is interesting. Already unreliable narration is happening, but the game's fairly simple, not too complicated. And then I think uh, Kojima just decided, okay, that's good. I'll just go work on other stuff. And then a colleague approached him on the train and apologized because he had been put on the team to make a sequel to Metal Gear. And that is I think it's Snake's Revenge or something like that.
Solid Snake,
And
right? Is that the
no, no,
is
no, no. So this is a different, there was an
Oh,
NES one
oh,
that this
oh.
guy was working on uh, behind Kojima's back. And so, uh, inspired by the, I guess, disrespect, Kojima penned this is the Apocrypha. Please don't blame me if it's wrong. It's part of the myth of Kojima. Is on that train ride, he conceived of a sequel to Metal Gear that is unbelievably interesting. And Metal Gear Solid actually feels a bit iterative after you've played Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake is the first time you see this systems level approach to telling a story. It's it I mean it actually has a really good story about this guy comes up with this compound called Oilix that replaces oil, and this bleeds into Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, 3, and 4 and the eventual war economy that happens in Metal Gear Solid 4. It's all tied together, and they retconned it, of course, but it's still tied together. And I think it's really interesting. So you play Metal Gear 2 and you have a radar system that shows with perfect accuracy where enemies are in a 16 room grid, and they're not rendered. Like,
Hmm.
people have gone in and looked at it. They're not rendered. The game just knows its systems work like clockwork. So it can tell you that a guard is going to come, and guards chase you across screens. This is 1990. Guards detect sound. You also can hide under things now. You can go prone and crawl along the floor. You can use sound to distract them. You can lay objects around to distract them. It's already sophisticated in 1990. And like there are already things where you're supposed to leave the text, go to the manual to solve puzzles. Like there's the manual of the game famously had tap codes that were actually used. And you have to like recognize these tap codes by listening to the sound in the game. You also have to control, like, yeah, you have to manipulate the way the wind is blowing at a certain point so you can parachute, and it's totally random. Like, there's a whole bunch of these systems already happening in 1990. And so I think that I think you're correct to say that this is the vision the whole time. Um, and for me, Metal Gear Solid 3 is the first time where their technical abilities have become have reached a level where they can kind of do what they want. And so it feels like a fun sandbox because it's really a team at their peak, just designing all of these different systems and just like falling independently in love with each of them, to the degree that it's surprising how well they work together because they're all so sophisticated. But yeah, that I just wanted to bring up that, like, yes, this is what Metal Gear is about the whole time.
That's amazing, Justin. I mean, I all I know about Metal Gear Solid 2 is what I've seen, a few screenshots and just the story, which is shockingly or just surprisingly present in Metal Gear Solid 1, I guess, or at least, the Gray Fox and Big Boss sort of saga, right? That's all from Solid Snake.
It's also weirdly present in Metal Gear Solid 3, and I brought this up thinking about how we would move from one to the other because Metal Selena Yarsk is rumored or thought to be, it's not canon, but there are certain parts of the franchise that have described it this way. It's Zanzibar Land, which is the location of Metal Gear 2.
That's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
just jump forward just for 1 second and
Yeah.
Brian, sorry, I want to give you space here, but
Yeah.
one of the amazing things about this series is it's like the continual effort of like retroactive synthesis. And I don't just mean retcons, but like just various kinds of sort of re-assimilating previous material and structures or spaces, But one, which is, I guess, a kind of retcon, but also just a stroke of pure brilliance, is Metal Gear Solid 5 is unfinished. Big spoilers for Metal Gear Solid 5. I've already spoiled the end of that game on this podcast, but I can sort of say even more about how that game ends because, yes, it seems to be unfinished. Its connection to the Metal Gear Solid series is left completely unrealized because we have Liquid Snake, who was seemingly supposed to play a big role as a child, play a big role in the coda or the conclusion to that game, and just drops out of the story. However, what we have, whether it's a kind of sutured on compensation ending or whether it was the original vision, is in fact a solution to the fundamental riddle of Metal Gear before Solid, which is that Big Boss dies and he comes back again. Big Boss dies in Metal Gear 1, and then you kill him again in Metal Gear 2. And there was basically no explanation for that, as I understand it, other than it's a video game. Like the bad, Cortex and Crash Bandicoot always comes back, Bowser always comes back, so Big Boss came back. But that, although Metal Gear Solid is a series that's very um, has a lot of fun with video game logic and structures and sort of self-consciously brings them in and justifies them, that was never motivated until the final moments of Metal Gear Solid 5, when you learn that the uh, nameless soldier you're playing as, who was re-engineered to be a copy of Big Boss, was the big boss that died in one of the original Metal Gear games. So in the first one, yeah. So the series actually ends on an incredibly satisfying bit of closure, like to wrap up, to sort of it's just so funny that what it justifies, right? Like what the very final note of the entire saga is, oh, you thought those two big bosses were just video game logic. No, there were actually two big bosses. Um, a kind of, and again, this sort of amazing. I talked about retroactive motivation on the last podcast, that hasn't actually aired yet, but I talked about the way that Metal Gear Solid 4 retroactively motivates technical limitations in Metal Gear Solid 1 in the frog soldiers, Justin. That the frogs are strikingly very similar to the way that guards in Metal Gear Solid 1 operate and almost seem like diegetic motivations of the more technically limited guards in Metal Gear Solid 1. This is finally a diegetic motivation of just this weird sort of, maybe it's a function of seriality. It's a function of the kind of like laissez-faire approach to storytelling in the 1980s and early 90s. It's a function of like, we need to have a sequel of Commerce, whatever, all of these different things that lead to Big Boss existing twice before he's even cloned in the saga of Metal Gear. That's what that's how the series ends. It's explaining that one last turn of the screw of like, oh, you thought we couldn't justify this? Well, we did, you know?
Yeah, there are infinite amounts of discussion we could have about this, basically. Not to mention in Metal Gear Solid 5, um, a lot of the game's plot is about child soldiers. Like a significant part of the game is about this. In Metal Gear 2, as you walk around Zanzibar Land, there are child soldiers everywhere. They're little kid sprites that say really funny stuff. Like they're just kids. And it's clear from the beginning that this is the vision of the time. So yeah, it's really interesting how later games kind of like solidify sketched out but not really fully realized for obvious reasons, technological, etc. Um, but yeah, I think the funniest part about the child soldiers in Metal Gear 2 is that at first you don't really put together that they're child soldiers. And I think that's part of why they got away with having child soldiers. Uh, in 1990, its content is definitely a thing that was censored or like policed a lot in video games, but of course in Japan he was making it for more adult audiences. It was more established. But the localization and because the localization came out after the success of the Metal Gear Solid series, it was kind of just taken for granted. And then 5 makes it a core part of the plot and kind of again continuously reframing earlier things that happened in the series and making them work together. Yeah, it's another key part of the it's like bringing it all into the simulation.
Mm.
Um, and then having it simulate that out again. And yeah, so I mean, the whole series I would say is about that. It's about copying, it's like copies of copies of copies of copies that can take on a life of their own within different types of systems, right? So Metal Gear Solid was framed, the Solid series has always had like tags that kind of generative ideas that frame what the game was supposed to be about. It frames the motivations of the villains. It frames the major discussions that happen in the expository cutscenes. And so Metal Gear Solid 1 is gene, the word gene. And the game is all about genes and the breaking of the human genome is a crucial detail and then Metal Gear Solid 2 is about meme, which it you just played it. It talks about meme all the time. It's about these different ways of reproducing uh and like duplicating messages all the way through. And 3 is about scene. And scene, the whole thing is a simulation. And so you kind of keep seeing these copies of copies of copies. Like, where's the original? The original is never it's never shown to us. The original is the boss and the Cobras who fought in real wars. There's no more real wars. And the whole universe is basically, iterative recursive cycles of the same effort to escape the boundaries of human finitude, like our genetics, the fact that we're social, the fact that we trust power to be benevolent, and it literally never will be. And 4, of course, follows along with this, and 5 and Peace Walker are they're all simulated events in this larger history that is literally the end of history, but it happened 100 years ago, and we're only recognizing it now. And so the whole series has an arc as well that I think leads us nicely to 3 with the idea of scene. it's a it's a game that's really obsessed with movies. Like you get to make your own movies. And then the characters react to those movies. Like you can do some funny stuff. And then you'll get a call from like Sigint or something like that. And you'll be or like you'll get a movie like paramedic will just tell you about a movie that she likes. And the whole thing is just this Hollywood action, Sean Connery. I don't want to make Metal Gear Solid anymore, but they're making me uh thing. Like there's always this. It's not just about the villains of the games trying to overcome their genes or the mimetic transmission of information, etc., etc. It's also about the fact that Kojima doesn't want to make Metal Gear anymore, but he can't escape it. It's part of who he is. And I think this is a wrestling match that um, is really interesting throughout the whole series. And 3, it manifests really in some strange ways. But
And just as a
yeah,
wrestling match
cool.
can having never seen a wrestling match in my entire life, or so I've read. So I've read that a wrestling match can spill out of the ring into the crowd. We might say that the wrestling match has now spilled out of the Metal Gear series and into the Death Stranding series. But
100%.
topic for another day.
Yeah, I guess like obviously I'm not as familiar with the history of the series. I've just really played these two games in isolation. And so my kind of main point that I'm still stuck on, although today I'm thinking about it a little bit differently, so maybe I'll ask both of you what you think about it. I mean, obviously names are super important in these games, you know. I mean, we have some pretty funny names, some names that Justin, as you said, not only like do the games themselves and like the verisimilitude of the world as a simulation seem to kind of endlessly repeat, but also names get sort of transferred between characters at certain points, and also one character will have multiple names. I mean, obviously this shows up in many different places. My main, reference point for this in an interesting way is Proust, right? I mean, so Odette, for example, who's one of the central, most important characters throughout the entirety of the novel. She's Odette, but then she's Madame Swan. Then she's Odette de Forcheville at the end of the novel when she marries after Swan dies. And then somewhere in the middle, the narrator knows her as the Lady in Pink. And then only later does he find out that she's this Odette and there's this connection. And so there's a way in which, like, of course, in any narrative, there are plot points, there are events, but the thing that I'm, sort of again stuck on a little bit in Metal Gear is that the real event for me as a player, or the event even at certain points for the characters themselves, seems to be these moments of recognition rather than something literally happening. Like this moment where, for instance, we realize that is it Ava is also Tatiana, but then she's also kind of neither of those by the end of the game, right? Like it's revealed that she's working for the Chinese or something like that. Um, and again, this brings me back to Proust because the question in the scholarship is, well, is Odette really this person? Is she really the lady in pink? Is she really, uh, this woman of ill repute, or is she this other thing that we see from a different angle at another time? And I think, one answer is kind of none of those, right? One answer is that it's perspectival or that it sort of depends on context. And one of the things that we've talked about on the pod a little bit is the question, and we've Justin, you already brought it up, the question of tone, right? Like the tone of these games and how we're supposed to kind of understand them when they're constantly upending themselves and us, I guess, in our interpretation. But yeah, I wonder if this kind of sparks anything, about names and both how names are obviously incredibly carefully chosen, but also ultimately arbitrary. I mean, I think this also comes back to a discussion Nathan and I had recently about chance in the games, right? Like there's this incredible meticulousness of the games, but at the same time, so much of it seems virtual, not in the sense of a simulation, but virtual in the sense of like philosophically virtual, right? Like there's a way in which it's all arbitrary because there's a system and we're just looking at this one iteration, but it could have been a different iteration at another time. So it seems kind of random in a way.
Yeah, Brian, I just want to jump in really quickly for another spoiler of Metal Gear Solid 4, because I think it might break your brain, which is that we learn, so the villain of Metal Gear Solid 4 is Liquid Ocelot. So it's exactly what you say, these two names smushed together.
Mm.
Um, like the lady in pink, Odette or whatever, you know. But we learn whereas throughout Metal Gear Solid 2 and 4, Ocelot's possession by Liquid Snake seems to be another radical element of chance that's sort of gumming up the machinations of the Patriots and of the characters, right? It's like actually Ocelot's the wild card because you never know if he's going to be Liquid or Ocelot. You know, he's like a Joker sort of figure, in the deck of cards sense. But we learn at the very end of Metal Gear Solid 4, and this is insane, that actually Ocelot was not possessed by Liquid Snake. Actually, it was part of a long-term plot hatched by Ocelot and Big Boss, in which Ocelot underwent psychotherapy and hypnosis to convince himself that he was Liquid Snake. So the hand thing is actually not real. He's effectively acting. He's acting as Liquid Snake, doing the British accent, or I guess he doesn't do the British accent, but taking on his mannerisms and pretending to be possessed by his hand, which again, just imagine like we talked about the sort of improbability of these deep state plots. Imagine if your deep state plot was you need to act like your hand is turning you into a different person. Truly insane shit. But yeah, it's like sort of so it seems to line up really well with your Proust analogy in that um, we learn at the end diegetically that in fact these were always two distinct people. That Liquid Ocelot is a fiction.
Mhm.
It's very believable though. Like you don't know what side he's on in this game, you don't know what side he's on in any game. I can't imagine turning on Metal Gear Solid 2 and having any fucking clue what's happening. He's like Shalashaska, he's why is he fighting against these why is he fighting against the Colonel? Like what's he doing, blowing everything up? How does he know Snake? Why does he change who he is? Why does Snake call him something else? It's really wild. It's like that opening sequence is just out of this universe, confusing if you don't, I imagine. And so it's a, yeah, I guess the way that I would put it to me, there's this there's always this just very fine tension between the player's perspective, which is always kind of corresponding to whoever you're controlling, Snake, someone else, um, in terms of what you do or do not know. So the first Metal Gear game I played was Metal Gear Solid, and I was always just laughing because I would be like, "What do you mean by this?" And then Snake would always be like, "What?" And he's just confused perpetually. And then two, of course, Solid Snake becomes the boss, right? He's in charge of pretty much the whole thing, and he's in on the scheme. And Raiden is the one that has literally no idea. Like Snake is finishing rooms before you get there, and you're walking through these like finished. See, it's almost like Hotline Miami, where the room has been cleared, and you're walking back through the room, and there's just like this awkward moment where you're like, whoever did this is obviously way more competent than me. And there's always this kind of transmission of that kind of relationship of like master student that in this game is of course the boss and future big boss. And of course, Jack in Metal Gear Solid 3 is supposed to also correspond directly to Jack in Metal Gear Solid 2. And the interesting thing about Raiden is that they call him Snake first. He's Snake, then he's Raiden, then he's Jack because Rosemary's there. And so, this weird shifting all the time. And of course, Metal Gear Solid ends with Solid Snake giving Otacon his real name, which is David. He's Dave. And so there's always this like, who are you really? What is your real name? Kind of thing that's underneath the whole series. And of course, in Metal Gear Solid 3, like we can start talking about it, like the virtuous mission is upon retro. Have you finished 3? Upon retrospect, it's obviously like clearly a setup and it's not virtuous at all. And there's a lot of things to be suspicious of, like these backroom deals between the US and Khrushchev, who's trying to basically keep a handle on his government, and this will expose that he's weak, but it will also expose that the US is breaking law, international conventions, all these different things. And so it's all about not creating a systemic. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but I'll return to the point of like shifting meaning all the time. Uh, From a meta perspective, this game is really about the Cold War. The Cold War is about to end because of, World War One level technicalities, right? And of course, this is the legacy This game is about the legacy of World War One and the pact between these different countries that they reunite and kind of fund the overcoming of the Axis powers in World War II. And then after that, war is kind of it's kind of over, and we end up in this phase where, and I think this is the point of Metal Gear Solid 3 at its core, it's about the times that you live in changing, right? And so, depending on the time, Ocelot is Liquid Ocelot, he's Shalashaska, he's Revolver Ocelot. Like, he changes with the times more than any other character. He's also present at every moment of the story, pretty much. He's always working in the background of all the stories and, doing different things. And so, his shifting identity is, again, I think really helpful for looking at the ways in which he adapts the different stages of this. I don't know. It's like this weird postmodern nativity where you're like moving from scene to scene of this, like you go from genes to memes to scenes to sense to peace to, and you're kind of like working through all these things, and it's in a way it's all about how these terms become deeply unsettled by the fact that the villains also see the context in this way, right? Um, and the end of Metal Gear Solid 3, you realize that the boss is basically like an incredible hero of proportions the big boss never gets to. And he has to act like he is that type of hero. And that sets the tone for the rest of the series where he's basically half Vulcan, half the boss. And he tries to create like a paradise beyond nation, because what happens in World War One, all these countries kind of work together, and the Cobra unit is made up of people from all the different blocks that end up basically at in conflict in World War Two and after World War Two. And so they're war buddies who are, by the context of history, forced to choose sides. And none of them choose any sides. And so they can change who they are at any given moment, including, Eva later on is important for reasons I don't want to spoil, but her loyalties become increasingly clear the further you go in the series. But even then, it's kind of hard to know where she stands. Same with Ocelot. Like at the end, the revelation that it was all a performance, you realize, oh, he's actually he's a hero. In a certain way, he's a hero. And it's through this reproduction of these different ideas that I think maybe you can trace these different generative tags for each game, that maybe you can kind of trace the shifting loyalties, but also the shifting titles.
So I have like one thought while you were just going there. I this kind of came to me. Um and it's, I guess, a pretty speculative thought or question that I wonder what you guys think is, so to go back to Proust again for a second, not only are names like, these sites of recognition or discovery or error or illusion or, whatever they happen to be, they also have this kind of almost synesthetic phenomenological content, right? So like in Proust, there's the whole section called the place name, and, uh, a place that he reads about has this imaginary quality to it, right? Or somebody's name, when he hears it, gives him this kind of imaginary sensation or this kind of aesthetic experience. It strikes me almost that names then on the contrary, in the Metal Gear series, seem emptied of this kind of content. Like names are taken for granted insofar as not that they're going to be the solid name forever. I mean, it's taken for granted that names are just going to change, but there doesn't ever seem to really be, I might be wrong, but maybe this is a strange way to put it, but I don't ever feel like I see characters experiencing names, if this makes sense, right? Like there's not really even though the names are so outlandish, right? And maybe because the names are so outlandish that We have several characters that are just called the something, right? Like the boss, the fear, the sorrow, whatever, and they're almost so overdetermined and so obvious that maybe there's no room for there to be content. Um, I mean, experiential or phenomenological content to the names, but yeah, I wonder. This is just a thought, I guess. I wonder what you think.
I think that's right. I mean, the I've always been struck by how the names of the Cobra unit seem well, first of all, there's a kind of asymmetry in that the end is not an emotion. Even so, it's like what's the end doing in there? Um, why is the pain so goofy? Like the pain, like, and the fear, like, is just not scary. You don't feel fear. The fear is kind of a gag. He's sort of like disgusting and like a weirdo. He's a disgusting weirdo. Um, so there's a basic mismatch between the name and the referent to some extent, I think, and among some of the Cobra unit. The only one that actually seems harmonious is maybe like the sorrow and the fury. Um, but then there is a sense in which names, yes, are very you know, unstable, but they're also really sticky. So the same names keep coming up throughout the entire historical saga. Um, Outer Heaven gets deployed again and again. Many places become named or get named Outer Heaven. And then there's Outer Haven in Metal Gear Solid 4, which this seems like a like sort of very basic point, but or rather like a stupid point. I was going to say the names verge on wordplay, and obviously they are wordplay. But what I mean by that is that like a kind of there's an actual like playing and modulation and modification of these sort of talismanic names of the series, and that actually is itself becomes literally assimilated into the plot. So when when Liquid Ocelot dubs his new version of Arsenal gear, Outer Haven, that is in like it's a knowing, it's a no, it's not Kojima doing the wordplay, it's Ocelot doing the wordplay, or whoever terms, I forget who actually names Outer Haven, but um that the characters themselves are able, maybe this is what I'm saying. Sorry, it's a roundabout way of getting to the speculative thought that the characters in Metal Gear Solid are themselves capable of wordplay. That's quite important insofar as the names are like a generative feature of the entire series, of the entire narrative, and that they keep coming back. They seem to sort of like they are these kind of like nodes of meaning, despite being somewhat slippery. Or when the colonel says, Snake, this will be the virtuous mission. And Snake says, virtual mission, which always seemed very corny to me. And I wondered if it was a translation thing or what. I don't actually know. But there is something very also brilliant about it because it's a misunderstanding, right? It seems like an implausible misunderstanding. And yet it's not implausible if we remember that VR missions are a core aspect of the Metal Gear Solid series. And so Snake is proleptically thinking of VR missions when he confuses virtuous mission for virtual mission. That itself is a kind of microcosm of the way that Metal Gear Solid 3 de technologizes the series temporarily because I mentioned on a previous podcast that then the tech comes roaring back in Metal Gear Solid 5 and Peace Walker. So it's like, oh, actually we have all this kind of crazy sci-fi stuff, but Metal Gear Solid 3 is like, no radio, no codec, no radar, no VR missions, but we will have a virtuous mission. And that substitution itself, it's like Naked Snake would have to have played, you know, Metal Gear Solid 2, which the audience of Metal Gear Solid 3, in fact, had, in order to make that verbal sort of mistake.
There's a lot of interplay with this and an equally important, um, I guess we can call it a Freudian slip because it's coming from the character. Uh, when Raiden hears the word node and is like, "What do you nerd?" And of course, the whole point is to make fun of the audience. It's like a direct pointing at them. And in this, of course, there's another like wink, 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 but it's also it's like it's diegetic. And so you know that that was actually a mistake that this character made at this mo it's not just the winking, but there's an even weirder moment where you don the what is it like the Radonovich mask and you infiltrate this base and find out I think that there's like a relationship between Volgan and Radonovich and people, react to you wearing this mask as though it's a part of the lived world, but it's obviously hilarious when you start the game. It asks if you've played Metal Gear Solid 2 or not, and if you say that you love Metal Gear Solid 2, it causes you to land at the start of the Virtuous mission with the Raiden mask. And of course, how does that exist? It doesn't. It's meant to be like a bit of a joke with you, but then of course it kind of it destabilizes that later by making Radanovich a key part of the plot. Like you can't sneak into that base without donning that unless you really want to create a bunch of havoc. And it's hilarious how that blurring of the line between what's part of the story world and what's part of the world beyond it um, is just a perfect expression, I think.
Absolutely. It's like, sorry, it just reminded me of, of a potential comparison, which is, well, it's a sort of cheeky, irreverent joke that, as you say, Justin, then gets literalized and assimilated into the narrative. And the comp I thought of was, isn't there not to get whatever R-rated on Mike here, but isn't there a Disney movie where there's like a penis in the sky or something? Am I making that up? Like there's the artists sort of seem maybe
Yeah,
you know and it would it's this kind of whatever maybe it's that's also powerful
it's
or
like Lion King. I'm pretty sure it says sex when he lies
yes.
down at the top of the,
There
yeah.
we go. So let's take that as an example. It would be as if in The Lion King 2, one of the creatures had erectile dysfunction or something. So it would be like this thing that was this weird, incongruous, impossible joke in previously then gets re-motivated diegetically into a core part of the plot. That's exactly what's happening with Raidenovich.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because I was going to actually also say, and there is like a maybe Freudian tie-in then, that from two to three, one other, because last time, Nathan, we talked about some of the differences between Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3. And it strikes me, it is, I guess, as a mechanic, it's important because you do use it to what is it to burn leeches or something like that, but you move from a cigarette to a cigar. So whereas in two you can equip the cigarette, and three you have the cigar. So sometimes not only is sometimes a cigar just a cigar, but sometimes a cigarette in fact becomes a cigar, I guess is
And one other that did remind me of one other interesting moment of like difference and sort of difference becoming uh negated, is in Metal Gear Solid 3, one of the Brian, you mentioned this in the last pod, like one of the innovations is the stamina meter,
Mhm.
which regulates how quickly your life meter refills. Um, and you need to eat. So it's Snake's physical well-being, right? In Metal Gear Solid 3. In Metal Gear Solid 4, there is the same exact system. So there is a meter that regulates how quickly your life meter refills, but it's now called the stress meter. And it's uh, solved or cured by taking meds or talking to Rosemary as your therapist. So a physical issue, right? A physical problem, or status then gets, uh, you know, transfigured without basically any functional difference into a mental status. So mind and body, ergo, are the same or something, or like, or stress is actually functionally equivalent to being out in the cold and not eating, you know. So it's a really striking, very clean and therefore exemplary, I think, repurposing of a mechanic and remotivating or renaming, with totally different implications. The idea is that in Metal Gear Solid 4, Snake is old and the battlefield is stressful and he's suffering anxiety in a way. It's there's a running gag where when characters in cutscenes call him old, they're like, "Oh, you're not Solid Snake, you're Old Snake." His stress meter will go down, so he'll start to feel more stressed or just kind of feel mentally and emotionally deflated, and so he'll have like he'll lose whatever, he'll lose his psych counters. So it's like the cigar to cigarette, but maybe with deeper, potentially deeper sort of like philosophical implications.
The funniest part is that in Metal Gear Solid 3, stamina is a function more of simulation, it seems to me, than anything. Whereas in 4, it's just kind of like a tool, it's a part of the toolkit of how to narrate the story.
Mm.
Like the funniest part is that because it's psychological, if you just ignore it, it almost never becomes a problem.
Yeah.
But rather, it becomes almost like a punchline at Snake's expense that allows to like reinforce the very cathartic emotional highs of the end of Solid Snake's story later. Um, but this repurposing plays into the story of Raiden as well in 4, where like suddenly Raiden is just really cool. Like he's a vet. He's played all these games and he's not too old. He's synthetic. But the whole point I'm trying to make, I guess, is that um the repurposing of it reminds me maybe not of Proust so much as it reminds me of Nabokov, who reappropriates details from his own life, from the fictional or the from the historical circumstances around him, and just uses them purely for fantastic reasons, like just to render the fantasy. And none of his stories are real, but he's literally incorporating like little parts of his own real world experience into this and like using them for different functions. And that's exactly what happens in the like I would say, yeah, Metal Gear Solid 3 is about when things were real and we still had to deal with them in a real way. It's like analog for sure, but it's also like just real. And the reality of the times is literally the only mechanism that creates the circumstances for the boss being a defector, but not really being a defector, um, for the Fox unit to get a chance to like test out if it's worthwhile. It's this like underdog, plucky new unit of the CIA, and they have to prove themselves as this heroic, but then they have to kind of recover their shame. The whole thing is about shifting your vantage point with the circumstances, and it's to me, it's this like reappropriation of the stamina, which does directly correspond to things you have to do in the gameplay. Like Snake can starve to death,
Mm.
or like it does make you not really like he can't shoot straight. He doesn't like the simulation falls apart because his body and his mind are like separate, actually.
Yeah.
Whereas in 4, the simulation, everything is so digitized that even Snake's psychological condition is digital. It's a function of like they call him old, then it goes all the way down. Then someone says, but he's not that old. He's still getting the job done, and it goes back up all the way. It's pure manipulation of the fact that this is technically a sequel to 3, which is like it's all become binary. Whereas in the original context of Metal Gear Solid 3, it's about the fact that no one wants to be digital. Like these people don't they're characters, of course, and they play it up, but they don't they're doing it out of resentment for the fact that, they're from different countries, but really they're brothers and sisters. And that's why they defect in the first place,
Hmm.
right? Huh.
The digitization point in four is really funny because it seems like it could be another one of those uncanny prophetic flourishes from Kojima. Not only did he predict AI slop. Actually, one of the striking things on my replay of Metal Gear Solid 4 is that the game begins with a montage of AI slop.
It's literally
Straight
AI
up.
slop.
It's
Yeah.
unbelievable. And it's totally decontextualized. There's no characters don't reference it later on. It's just like hit you over the head before the credits with just garbage stuff generated out of the trash that's circulating through the Patriots neural
And
network.
the funniest part is that that's, in my view, that's the first time, I guess, in Metal Gear Solid 2 at the end, you do see real people. But at that point, you're so confused, you don't know if they're real or not. Like, is this another performance? Have the Patriots orchestrated that these are the people? Like, Rosemary is a total fake. So
Yeah.
how can I trust that I'm actually in New York City at the end of that game? Whereas in, yeah, I think in 4, it's like you don't know where you are at any given point because you're kind of nowhere, and you're dealing with all these different these forces that you're not even allied to. Like, you don't care about the local insurgents fighting against these PMCs. Like, it's just that's the economy, right?
Yeah.
It's become reappropri that conflict of Metal Gear Solid 3, which is true, and Vulcan is one of the more relatable characters because he's just like, we just want to be free. We don't really want to like live this life anymore where we're all used by our nation to carry forward this meme. What about us? And that's what Big Boss's story ends up becoming about, is like, what about the people who sacrificed their life for a new world, and then the new world ate them or tried to eat them. And 3 is the first crack in that, the original what are they called? The philosophers.
Mhm.
Um, where they, that legacy becomes the virtual legacy of this like AI future. And so at the end of Metal Gear Solid 2, you see real life happening. Like, Snake walks down a bridge, there's cars driving by at the start of the game, but you then see people uh, who are like just kind of walking around. It's really weird because this huge explosion just happened, and people are sort of chill about it,
Yeah,
and you're not sure.
Arsenal Gear has just plowed into Lower Manhattan and
It's
leveled
wild.
half of it, and people seem to be walking to work.
It's weird.
Yeah,
And that's obviously, again, part of the point, right? And in 3, that would generate a reaction. But at the beginning of 4, the interesting thing to me is that you see from the perspective of normal people in this universe for the first time, and what you see is absolute bullshit AI slop. They're just fed crap.
yeah. It's unreal and uncanny. And I was just gonna say, so to add to the list of prophetic achievements, AI slop, of course, Kojima most famously predicted online echo chambers and the kind of post-truth, post-fact era. He predicted COVID and Death Stranding, but he also predicted Zoom therapy because in Metal Gear Solid 4, as you get stressed out from the digitized version of reality in battle, the way to fix it is to call Rosemary and to have a Zoom therapy appointment with her. The codec has turned into a full camera Zoom, basically. So it is this funny thing of like, in during COVID when everyone was depressed from being on their computers all the time, and then the way to sort of alleviate that was to then talk on your computer to a therapist, and not go to the office and not have sort of face-to-face contact with somebody. So it's another funny just wrinkle of or another example of the way that digitization is baked into Metal Gear Solid 4
It's
in a really striking way.
I have the image of the baptism with the like super soaker, and that's a weirdly appropriate image for this series because everything you do has incredible stakes apparently, but never feels like it. And yeah, I think that separation, like, there's moments where in Metal Gear Solid 4, of course, you're using your body to sense the environment. It's all about that, and you have this reactive camouflage, that a system that carries over from 3 to 4. Sorry, Brian, we keep talking about the whole series. It's impossible not to, I guess, but uh, the camouflage system in 3 serves as like it's shockingly deep and real. Like, you're wearing different clothes to look to fit into different environments, and the implication is that Snake is actually like drawing these camouflages on himself and donning different uniforms. And the characters, when you call them on the codec, they react to what you're doing. So if you're wearing a funny costume at the wrong moment, or you're hiding in a box and you call Sigint or something like that, and he'll just tell you how ridiculous you are. And it's like very playful and fun and arcadey. And then in four, it becomes digital and automated and completely immersed or concretized, like technologically concretized as part of the body
Hmm.
in a weird way. Like you're putting it on the body like a costume in three, and then in four, your body just adapts to the virtual environment because it's just all data. And so there's this constant carrying forward of these ideas into different situations and contexts that gives them a repurposing 100%. Like it's just a new vantage point.
Brian, did you in Metal Gear Solid 2, did you encounter the soldier who is peeing off the side of the big shell?
Yes, yeah, I did.
So just to speak to Justin, your point about how reactive the characters are diegetically to your goofy actions. If you stand under the piss and call Rosemary, she'll be like, "Ew, Jack, that's disgusting," or something like that. And it's just, it's this very weird, or not weird, but it's such a niche or unlikely scenario that the player would go like stand under the piss stream and then dial up their girlfriend, their video game girlfriend. But that's the game has the contingencies with that, and remarks on it, and that's emblematic of the way that characters will, yeah, as you say, Justin, like respond to what you're doing, and I almost want to say that Metal Gear Solid 4, as it de-emphasizes the codec, has less of that. I didn't even test it out, but I sort of feel like the codec in 4, it's much more animated, it's much more graphically interesting, even though it's still boring. But it no longer becomes a sort of running commentary on the interactions that the system itself will allow.
I still love when you're taking all the photos at the near the beginning of two, where you find the one guy who has like no pants on or whatever, and Snake just goes, "Nice." So it's not only just like a realistic reaction, it's like a funny, realistic, whatever, joking reaction, I guess, to see, because I mean the context in which you just see a guy without pants on and say nice is like a very specific context, um, which maybe just again like uh yeah, doubles down on the complexity of what's happening in the game. Even when it is, as we've said before too, I think I you said, Nathan, a while back when we were talking about Metal Gear Solid 2, that it's explicit has explicit stupidity or goofiness or something like that. And I definitely think that's somehow been incorporated into like the complexity of what's happening.
I'll never forget when I started playing Metal Gear Solid 2 and I slipped in the seagull shit the first time. And the other time that I'll never forget is when you fight Olga, uh, and after you defeat her, she's just lying there, unconscious. And you can just take your tranquilizer and shoot her in the face a whole bunch. You can take a picture of it, and you'll get a codec call, and you'll be yelled at. Like, what are you doing? She's pregnant. You know she's pregnant. How could you do this? And then when you develop the photo, again, you get shit for it. And so there's a whole bunch of these funny interactions, or like the fact that Snake can zoom in on the pictures of the models in the lockers and kiss them. And then if you knock the lockers down, the picture side lands up. The guards will be distracted and like almost as though they're trying to kiss it as well. It's like this really weird uniformity of like accounting for the ridiculous way that players play games. Like you want to do everything you can. Like, of course, the joke is like, of course, you're going to zoom in on these pictures because these are hot models, and you're going to want to see them like up close in person. And of course, then there's this funny noise that winkingly says like we're on the same page here, and that reliability is kind of like it's like reliable unreliability of the systems to be more emergent than you expect. Like like doing pull-ups or chin-ups, giving you a system. It's of course it's situationally useful, but it obviously also ties into the leveling up of your character over time. But like diegetically, it's hilarious to just think that this dude, this super soldier, is just doing like infinite pull-ups so that he finally can hold on to the like he's already a trained expert. Like he should be good at all of this stuff already, but of course you start at grip level 1 because it's a game.
Yeah.
And these things all tie in together. It's like the weirdness and glitchiness of movies, the glitchiness of literature, the glitchiness of games, and simulation as an idea all put together, and like you just letting those parts, like I don't care about, sanding over the gap. The gap is actually part of sensation in 4, of course. Like you don't even know if what's happening is real or not. Like people can't control their own bodies. Whereas in 3, I think it's still relatively tied to, ironically, it's almost an inversion of 4. It's like these events are hyper real, and your relationship to them is very physical or like material. But I mean, Selena Yarsk is really fake, and it's like they put crocodiles from a different continent there, and rats from Norway, and the whole thing is set up for Jack to become Big Boss. It's all this simulation, which is part of his later story. Like we're gonna break the simulation is kind of the whole ethos of Big Boss.
I was just gonna say, Justin, on the guards' goofy reaction to the model posters, or if you leave a what the game calls a book, which is a pornographic magazine, on the
It's
ground.
porno mag, yeah.
Yeah, the guards will sort of drop to their knees and sort of like go sort of yeah, just have this outsized sort of yeah, very almost anime-esque sort of animation of like horniness, you know? And
Yeah, yeah.
and I like to think of the game as similar to The Sims, you know, in that the
Hmm.
Sims react to everything with this very cartoonish way, but the sheer range of their canned reactions itself creates, and the reliability of those reactions creates this very deep sense of reality. So like if you individually watch a soldier like trying to kiss a model, you know, a poster, it's like the game is so stupid and unreal and goofy, right? But actually, if you combine all those things at a certain density, it creates the sense that the world reacts to everything. And again, to go back to our like that original point, you know, that we started on, like reacts in an incredibly reliable way. And actually, the reliability is even though it's not necessarily true to life, there's this great Eurogamer essay. I wish I remember who it's by. I can link it. I talked about this on the Skyrim episode because it's an essay about Skyrim. But the author makes the point that um, when things in games behave with total consistency, we can really believe in them and we can believe in the world. And the guards react in the same stupid way with total consistency and to such, again, a corner case unlikely scenario or set of circumstances that you've destroyed a breakable locker, which is already itself a technological marvel for PS2, and have managed to destroy one or happen to destroy one that has a poster on the inside, and then a guard has been kited into the area where the poster is, you know. But the fact that they do that speaks to just the sort of total comprehension of the simulation. The last thing I wanted to say too was about the bird shit, which I mentioned in the last pod or 2 pods ago. It strikes me now that the bird shit is one of the maybe the best systemic Chekhov's gun of all time. Because in and we can let's just coin that phrase for ADT, a systemic Chekhov's gun. It would be fun to think of other examples, but you can slip on bird shit in the big shell, and you learn that quite early on if you try to run up on the roof area of the first strut. Totally inconsequential. Late in the game, Brian, remember when the bridge is destroyed and there's a platforming sequence, one of the many gameplay wrinkles, you know, there's a platforming sequence that heavily features bird shit. So suddenly the fact that you can slip on bird shit becomes ludically important. And it's again, it's like the Raiden mask. It's like this very silly gag. Like it's physically impossible. You wouldn't step on bird shit, especially let alone in highly advanced sneaking shoes, right? And slip like you stepped on a banana peel, which is itself not realistic. Um, but you slip on bird shit while platforming on pipes, that are suspended hundreds of feet above the Atlantic Ocean. And it becomes equivalent to like a wheel of fire in Mario. It's like this little platforming obstacle that you need to be very conscious of and need to avoid with the same precision that you would use to jump over a Goomba.
I
Unless
was
you,
gonna say one last thing. I'm very sorry because that brings us full circle back to Outer Wilds, actually, funny enough, which I will reinforce that is very important to play. And are you planning on doing more discussions of MGS3?
Probably not, not in the near future. Yeah.
No, cool. Okay, we didn't talk about it as much as maybe we would have hoped, but I think we did talk about it in a bunch of different ways. But the idea of like a systemic Chekhov's gun, Outer Wilds does this too with the probe that you see when you first open your eyes, which
Yes.
just becomes like the most important. It's so important, and you have no idea what you're looking at until later on in the game. And when it clicks, you're like, "Oh my God!" And that kind of it reminds me, I don't always agree with game studies people, but one person who's probably a little more reliable, in my opinion, and more helpful is Espen Arnseth. When he talks about the idea of the intrigant structure. So in drama, of course, we have intrigue, right? Like there's this kind of the characters devise intrigues against each other, and we kind of know what's happening as the audience in a more total way. And these characters, dramatic irony is like the character doesn't know what we already know, and there's this like almost like collaboratively held veil between the theatrical world that's being presented and the audience who could shout out at any given moment, but the character would never hear them. And there's this interesting play in more modern theater where as the medium evolved and had to react to cinema and other things that it tried to incorporate these more um cinematic understandings of like continuity or the boundaries of a universe. And I think with games like there's an interesting question there in terms of not only just the mediation of all these different forms, but the fact that um I guess it's not just that you can play with it, but that there's a certain knowing competition between the designer who creates puzzles and the player who has to kind of overcome them. And I'm still wrestling with this idea, and I'm not sure that it constitutes game temporality in a way that narrative temporality already wouldn't do. But Arseth comes up with this idea that it's called the intrigant structure, and later he talks about, or maybe before, but I think they're harmonious together as a kind of like coherent vision of game space-time. He talks about the idea of aporia and epiphany. And to me, the because a game is first, because Metal Gear Solid is first of all a game, and it presents a story through other means and so on, you might think that there's a separation between the gaminess and the narrative. But of course, these gameplay ideas become core narrative devices in future works. And it's like this constant like bringing into the fold of other media's approaches to narration into the video game form, which is kind of I think the process that this game is kind of a meta commentary on. Like there was a reality, and everything else has just been a farce of that reality ever since. And that's why to me the like unreliability, inconsistency, goofiness, shifts in tone, like wild exposition about like the deepest parts of people's personas, and then like all of that thrown together with scat humor, where like you can stand in someone's piss stream and like call your friends about it, you know. And that to me, that's a strangely appropriate way to look at like hypermediation, and like the confluence of media in our environment today, and that we have to interact with this and make sense of it is itself a structure of like oscillations between aporia and epiphany, but no one in reality, no one is designing the intrigue. And I think that that's also somewhat where the series tries to go, starting with three.
Yeah, that's great, Justin. And I do want to register something you said, I mean, here, but also much earlier, uh, about the question of reality. Like Metal Gear Solid 3 begins as this gesture of, okay, now things are real,
Mhm.
no more simulation. And I talked a bit on the last pod about how the one funny thing about Metal Gear Solid 3 is that so Metal Gear Solid 2 motivates the iterative and repetitive nature of a video game sequel, right? It has the same structure as Metal Gear Solid 1, but then the twist is that, oh, well, it's Metal Gear Solid 1. But then Metal Gear Solid 3 comes in and also repeats Metal Gear Solid 1 in many ways, but it's seemingly not at first a simulation, right? It seems to be real. And that was my argument I made last time, but Justin, I mean, you're, I think, rightly pointing out that there is a lot of simulation happening in Metal Gear Solid 3, and that in fact, what we thought was really just seen. And I love, I mean, you said this early, at the beginning of our conversation, but I think maybe it's a good place to end. I love the idea that reality in the Metal Gear Solid is actually World War II, and that it's therefore it is the kind of transcendental signified, that arrests the infinite regress of signifiers. The idea that there is this foundational reality that is the anchor for all of this semiotic play and unreality, And Justin, you pointed out, like, not only did you make that suggestion, which I think is brilliant, but you pointed out that like we never get to see it. And I love that idea that it's always somewhere, it's always going to be somewhere else. I taught a class on the whole, basically, the course was called Playing in Reality. And we read a lot of theory and we did the main games we played were the Metal Gear Solid games. Um, and one student, we were talking about other ways the series might go, and he brought up the fact, or maybe rumors that like at some point maybe Konami will make a prequel featuring the boss in World War II. And at the time, I was like, that's a great idea. That seems really fun. That seems really cool. But it would be a betrayal of
Yeah.
the structure, that you sketched out, Justin, that we should never be able to see World War II within the Metal Gear Solid saga precisely because you know, it's the unreachable, imperceptible real.
Yeah, yeah, and it to me the argument almost seems to be that, you know, um not to bring it to today too directly, but the fact that history is strangely about the past, but it's also prefiguring of the future. And I think these games kind of make the argument that it's prefiguring of the future because we're constantly like imitating or reproducing history, and that's why it has these cycles. And the interesting thing is that the generation where reality last occurred is the silent generation. And I think that that's very appropriate.
Well, thank you, Justin. This was great. Maybe we do need to have you on to just talk Metal Gear Solid 3. Metal Gear Solid 3 will be like it's sort of like the Arsenal. We booked an entire podcast last week to talk about the Arsenal Gear section of Metal Gear Solid 2, which we didn't even get to in our dedicated Metal Gear Solid 2 pod. And then in the last pod, we barely talked about Arsenal Gear, or barely scratched the surface of Arsenal Gear. Um, so maybe there will be a kind of infinite, not an infinite regress, but an infinite deferral or continuation of Metal Gear Solid, which seems totally right because it actually is impossible to stop talking about Metal Gear Solid. It's like Proust, Brian, like or Outer Wilds. It's one of those. It really is an infinite text. So let's say uh goodbye for now, but we'll come back to this soon enough, I'm sure. And we'd love to have you on for anything else. Maybe when we do
Great.
Outer Wilds.
Hmm.
That would be really great. I would really love to talk about Outer Wilds.
Perfect. Well,
Thanks, guys.
until then, gentlemen, just remember to keep that magic lantern lit.